The legendary English archers were the terror of the French knights, heroes of the 100 Years' War, shouted in ballads. Their accurate arrows, according to chronicles, could pierce armor and sow death on the battlefield. But have you ever wondered what price an ordinary yeoman or peasant paid for the right to be called a royal archer? Was his life a succession of glorious victories and lavish rewards? Or did the glitter of legend hide a harsh, grueling, and often very short reality? Watch this video to the end, and you will find out how hard the lives of those who forged the victories of medieval England with their skills were. The symbol of English military supremacy is the long yew bow, a weapon requiring not only marksmanship, but also incredible physical strength. Its tension could reach 100 or even 150 pounds. Imagine the daily, hours-long training required just to learn to wield it. This bow was not just a weapon, it became part of the archer's body, an extension of him. But at what cost? Years of exercise with such a powerful weapon inevitably left its mark. The skeletons of medieval English archers, studied by archaeologists, often show characteristic deformations of the bones of the shoulder girdle. Developed muscles on one side of the body, curvature of the spine, arthritis in the joints. All these were occupational diseases of those who devoted their lives to the art of longbow shooting. The bow gave them power and status, but in return they demanded health and youth, wearing out their bodies before their time. Boys began practicing at an early age, gradually moving from light bows to more powerful bows. Royal decrees mandated compulsory practice on Sundays and holidays, canceling other games and amusements. The whole nation seemed to be preparing for war, and the bow was its main argument. But this training was grueling. The calluses on his fingers from the bowstring, the pain in his muscles, the constant strain, all this was the daily routine of the future warrior. The bow was a faithful friend in battle, but in civilian life it remained a heavy burden, a reminder of the price that had to be paid for military skill. And if in battle the bow saved life, in peacetime it slowly took it away, turning strong young men into exhausted veterans long before old age. Such was the dialectic of this formidable weapon, a source of glory and a cause of suffering, an instrument of victory and an instrument of self-destruction. Behind the glittering legends of the invincible English archers was the harsh truth of the physical sacrifices made on the altar of military glory. Their mighty bows were not only a symbol of England's strength, but also a silent testament to the enormous price that ordinary people paid for it. For the medieval English archer, the battlefield was not a place of nobility or jousting, as it was for the armored nobleman. It was an open, windswept space where death was at every turn, and where he was far more vulnerable than his lord. Unlike heavily armed knights, archers rarely had full armor protection. Their usual armor was a quilted jacket, jack or gambeson, sometimes reinforced with metal plates, brigandine, and a simple helmet, capellina or salade. Such protection was not good against a direct hit from an enemy arrow or crossbow bolt. On the battlefield, archers acted in large groups, often positioned on the flanks or in front of the main forces. Their task was to disrupt the enemy's ranks, knock the attacking knights out of their saddles, and sow panic with a hail of arrows. But at the same time, they themselves became an easy target for enemy gunners and artillery, if the enemy had any. The archers often drove sharpened stakes in front of them before the battle to create a barrier for the attacking cavalry. But it did not always save, especially if the attack was swift and massive. In hand-to-hand combat, if it came to it, the archer with his light armor was clearly at a disadvantage. The battles of the 100 Years' War, such as Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, where English archers played a decisive role, were incredibly bloody. The battlefields were strewn with the bodies of the dead and wounded. For an archer standing in the front lines under a hail of arrows and enemy attacks, the chances of survival were far from 100%. The atmosphere of the battle was terrifying. The screams of the wounded, the neighing of horses, the clanking of weapons, the whistling of arrows, the clouds of smoke and dust. All this created an incredible psychological tension, fear, fatigue, thirst, pain, constant companions of an archer in battle. He had to keep his cool to shoot accurately and follow commands. After the battle, another hard work began, collecting arrows, helping wounded comrades, burying the dead. The sight of mutilated bodies, the groans of the dying, all this left deep scars not only on the body, but also in the soul. The battlefield was not only a place of glory, but also a place of unbearable suffering and loss. And even if an archer managed to survive a few battles, the risk of dying from an accidental arrow, disease in camp, or during a long, grueling campaign remained very high. The life of a soldier in that era was short and full of danger, and the archer was no exception to this rule. His skill was deadly to the enemy, but his own life was constantly hanging in the balance. Although the English archers were renowned for their aggressive tactics and their ability to devastate the enemy, they were not reckless daredevils. Their instinct for self-preservation and basic military cunning forced them to seek some shelter on the battlefield when the situation became particularly dangerous. The ideal position for archers was an elevated position from which they could fire effectively at the enemy while remaining less vulnerable to return fire. The use of natural terrain, hills, ravines, forest edges, was an important part of tactics. Commanders tried to choose such positions. However, it was not always possible to find perfect cover. They often had to operate in open terrain where archers were completely defenseless against enemy arrows or cavalry attacks. In such cases, they resorted to creating artificial obstacles, the most famous of which were sharpened stakes. These stakes, which archers carried with them or made on the spot, were driven into the ground at an angle toward the enemy. They created a kind of barrier that could stop or slow down a cavalry attack, giving the archers time to retreat or aim their fire at the rushing knights. During an intense firefight, when enemy arrows were flying particularly thickly, archers could duck to the ground, use shields paves if their squad had them, although this was more typical for crossbowmen, or simply hide behind the bodies of dead or wounded comrades. It was a cruel necessity dictated by desperation. In some cases, the archers could use the wagons of the wagon train for cover if the battle was close to the camp, or ruin buildings if they happened to be on the battlefield. Any object that could provide at least temporary protection was used. The ability to quickly find or create cover was an important skill. Archery commanders also played an important role in ensuring their safety. They had to keep an eye on the battlefield and give commands to change position, withdraw, or take up defenses. The lives of hundreds of men entrusted to their command often depended on their experience and coolness. Despite all these tricks, casualties among the archers were high. Their role on the battlefield was too important for them to sit in hiding all the time. They had to fire at the risk of their own lives to ensure the victory of their army, and they did so with courage and fortitude. Finding cover in a hail of arrows was not a sign of cowardice, but of common sense and tactical skill. It was part of the complex game of death that every archer played on the battlefield, where a moment's carelessness or a wrong decision could cost him his life. The equipment of the medieval English archer was not only his weapon in defense, but also his second skin, which he practically never parted with during long military campaigns. It had to be functional, reliable, but at the same time not too expensive and heavy, because archers often made long journeys on foot. The archer's protective equipment was usually based on a jack, a quilted jacket made of several layers of dense fabric, linen or canvas, quilted together with padding made of horsehair, hemp, or old rags. The jacket was relatively light, did not constrict movement, and provided some protection from sliding blows. Sometimes jack was reinforced with metal plates sewn between layers of cloth. Such armor was called brigandine. It gave better protection, but was heavier and more expensive. The archer's head was protected by a helmet, which could be a simple capellina, iron cap with brim, or a more closed sallet. To protect the hand that held the bow, a bracer, a leather or horn armband, was used to protect the forearm from being struck by the bowstring. The fingers of the hand that drew the bowstring were protected by a special leather glove, or leather mitts, to prevent blisters and cuts. In addition to the bow and arrow, the archer carried a melee weapon in case the enemy managed to break through to his position. This could be a short sword, a long dagger, basilard, a battle axe, or a heavy stick, maul. The choice depended on personal preference and availability of weapons. Clothing under the armor consisted of a linen shirt and woolen stocking pants. Shoes were sturdy leather clogs or low boots. In cold weather, archers wore woolen cloaks or capes. All this equipment was rather crude but practical, designed for the harsh conditions of marching life. As for comfort, there was very little of it. The archers often slept in the open air, wrapped in their cloaks, or at best in tents, if the squad had any. The bed was a pile of straw or simply bare ground. Hygiene in camping conditions was at the most primitive level. The equipment required constant maintenance. Bows had to be protected from dampness. The bowstring had to be periodically changed or waxed. Arrows had to be repaired. Plumage and tips changed. Armor and weapons had to be cleaned from rust. All of this took time and energy, especially after a hard crossing or battle. Thus, the archer's equipment was his faithful companion, but also a source of constant worry. It gave him some protection and the ability to fulfill his combat task, but it did not provide comfort and did not save him from all the dangers of the harsh military life. It was his second, very tough skin. The life of a medieval English archer was inextricably linked to military campaigns, which often lasted months or even years. The 100 Years' War, for example, forced thousands of English soldiers to cross the English Channel and fight on foreign soil, far from home and family. These campaigns were an ordeal. We moved mostly on foot, long, exhausting marches on broken roads in any weather, under the scorching sun, pouring rain, or icy wind and snow. The archer carried not only his weapons and armor, but also some provisions and personal belongings. The total weight of the equipment could reach several tens of pounds. My legs were bleeding and my muscles ached with fatigue, but I had to keep moving forward, keeping up with the squad. To lag behind meant almost certain death at the hands of the enemy or marauders, or simply from hunger and cold in unfamiliar terrain. Discipline in the army was severe, and disobedience or desertion was punishable by death. Overnight camping was far from comfortable. If we were lucky, we camped and put up tents. But often it was necessary to sleep in the open air, right on the cold, damp ground, using as a bedding only an armful of straw or one's own cloak. In the cold season, such overnight stays were a real torture. The drenched clothes had no time to dry, the body was stiff with cold, and sleep was troubling and did not bring rest. In the morning, they had to rise again, gather their simple belongings, and continue on their way, despite the fatigue and chill. Fires were lit with care so as not to attract the attention of the enemy. Lack of clean drinking water and proper food was a constant problem. Soldiers often suffered from gastrointestinal diseases and dysentery, which in unsanitary conditions could become epidemics and claim more lives than enemy arrows. Medical care was at the most primitive level. Wounds received in battle or during a campaign were often infected, leading to gangrene and death. Simple illnesses, such as a cold or fever, could have severe consequences for a weakened soldier's body. Morale was sustained by faith in the king, hope for booty and glory, and a sense of camaraderie. But the long months of hardship, the constant danger, and the sight of suffering and death of comrades could not help but affect the psyche of the archers. Many of them returned home, if they were lucky enough to survive, broken men. Long treks and icy overnight stays were an integral part of the life of the medieval English archer. It was a harsh school of survival that hardened some and broke others, but which was essential to the waging of the wars of the era. It was in these trials that the glory of the English soldier was forged. In addition to the physical hardships and dangers of the battlefield, the life of the medieval English archer was marred by other, less obvious, but no less severe factors. One of them was the darkness of ignorance, limited knowledge of the surrounding world, the causes of war, and the command's plans. Most archers came from the common people: peasants, artisans, small landowners, yeomen. The literacy rate among them was very low. They did not read books, had no access to maps or dispatches. Their world was limited to their home village, parish, at best a county. Their notions of the geography of enemy territory were of the vaguest kind. The reasons for the war for which they had shed blood were often unclear to them. Patriotic feelings and loyalty to king and lord certainly played a role, but the underlying political or dynastic motives behind the conflict were far from their grasp. They fought because they were ordered to, or because it was a way to make a living and escape poverty. On the battlefield, the archer saw only a small section of the battle: his position, his comrades, the nearest enemy. The overall picture of the battle, the tactical plans of the commanders, were unknown to him. He acted on commands, often not understanding why it was necessary to advance or retreat, why the enemy was attacking here. This created a sense of chaos, uncertainty, the fog of war. Rumors, speculations, superstitions were widespread among soldiers. Unexplained phenomena were attributed to witchcraft or divine intervention. The fear of the unknown, of supernatural forces, was as real as the fear of enemy weapons. Prayer and amulets were an important part of a soldier's life. The lack of information created anxiety and uncertainty. The archer did not know what awaited him tomorrow. A new battle, a long journey, hunger or sickness. He lived one day at a time, hoping for luck and God's mercy. This uncertainty was a heavy psychological burden, exhausting him no less than physical exertion. Of course, there were also experienced veterans who knew about warfare, understood tactics, and could foresee the development of events. But for the majority of ordinary archers, the war remained a series of incomprehensible and terrible events, where they were just pawns in a big game planned by the powers that be. This darkness of ignorance and fog of war added to the plight of the soldier. They made the archer more vulnerable not only physically, but also mentally, depriving him of the ability to fully control his destiny and understand the meaning of what was happening. It was another invisible but heavy burden to carry on one's shoulders. The effectiveness of the English archer on the battlefield depended directly on his physical strength and endurance, and this required adequate nutrition. However, providing food for a large army in the Middle Ages was a logistical challenge, and a soldier's rations were often very meager. Officially, soldiers, including archers, were entitled to a certain ration. It usually consisted of bread, often rye or barley, meat, corned beef or fresh meat if they could slaughter cattle, ale or wine, and sometimes cheese, peas, or beans. But that was the theory. In practice, things were much worse. The Army's supply system was far from perfect. Food shipments often fell behind, were attacked, and food spoiled on the road. As a result, soldiers often starved or received irregular and reduced rations. It was especially difficult during sieges or extended operations in enemy territory. The quality of food also left much to be desired. Bread could be stale or moldy, corned beef could be oversalted and tough, and ale could be diluted or sour. Soldiers often suffered from food poisoning and intestinal disorders, which weakened them as much as their wounds. To survive, archers had to resort to foraging, that is, simply plundering the local population, taking livestock, grain, and vegetables from peasants. This was common in medieval armies, but was hated by the local population and often led to retaliatory acts of violence. Foraging was a risky occupation. Sometimes soldiers were able to hunt or fish to diversify their rations. But this was not always possible, and the booty was seldom plentiful. More often, they had to make do with what they were given, or with what they could get, not always honestly. In camping conditions, food was cooked on common cauldrons and fires. The process was primitive, and hygiene was absent. Chowder from what they managed to gather was the main dish. Hot food was important not only for satiety, but also for warmth, especially in cold weather. Malnutrition, poor quality food, lack of vitamins, all this undermined the health of archers, reduced their fighting ability. Weakened body was more susceptible to disease. Wounds took longer to heal. A hungry and angry soldier was a bad warrior, prone to disobedience and looting. Commanders certainly understood the importance of supply, but could not always provide it. Logistics was the weak point of medieval armies. Therefore, meager and irregular rations were one of the most serious burdens of a soldier's life, making war not only a battle with the enemy, but also a battle with his own stomach. It was harsh fuel for the war machine. In the inhuman conditions of medieval warfare, amidst constant hardship, danger, and suffering, the only support and encouragement for the English archer often became his comrades in arms. Fighting brotherhood, a sense of elbow mutual assistance, these were not just beautiful words, but a vital necessity, a guarantee of survival. Archers usually served in squads, or companies, which were formed by captains who had received a contract from a king or noble lord. Close ties were formed within such a company. People who came from the same area, knew each other before the war, or had simply been through many trials together became more than just coworkers. They trained together, honing their skills, went into battle together, covering each other, shared their meager rations and the hardships of hiking life together. This joint struggle brought them closer together, created a special atmosphere of solidarity and mutual responsibility. The loss of a comrade was perceived as a personal tragedy. In battle, the archers acted as a single coordinated mechanism. The success of volley firing depended on the discipline and coordination of the entire squad. Everyone had to trust his comrades, to know that they would not falter, would not run away, would fulfill their duty. This trust was born of shared experience and respect for each other's skills. After the battle, they healed wounds together, buried the fallen, and shared trophies, if any. They told stories, sang songs, and remembered home. This helped to distract from the horrors of war, to preserve the human face, not to harden the soul. Humor, often crude and soldierly, was also a way to cope with stress. More experienced veterans mentored young recruits, passing on their knowledge and skills and helping them adapt to the rigors of Army life. It was a kind of informal training and support system, vital to the replenishment of the ranks. Betrayal or cowardice in battle was harshly condemned and could lead to banishment. The sense of belonging to the brotherhood of battle gave the archer strength to endure hardships. He knew that he was not alone, that there were people he could rely on who would not leave him in trouble. This confidence was a powerful moral factor that helped him keep his morale up even in the most desperate situations. Of course, there were conflicts, quarrels, and jealousy in this environment as well. But the common danger and the need to survive together usually smoothed out the contradictions. Fighting brotherhood was not ideal, but it was a real force that helped the English archers to overcome not only the enemy, but also themselves, their fears and weaknesses. This unity in need, forged in the crucible of war, was perhaps one of the few bright moments in their hard and dangerous lives. It turned the mercenary crowd into a formidable fighting force and left a mark on their souls for the rest of their lives, if they were to return home. After a long, grueling march or a bloody battle, a campfire was not only a source of warmth and light for the English archer, but also a symbol of temporary rest, safety, and companionship. However, this rare luxury also carried certain dangers. Campfires were strictly regulated. They were allowed only in designated areas and under supervision to avoid accidental fires of tents or equipment. In conditions of overcrowding and abundance of flammable materials, a fire in the camp could have catastrophic consequences. The main function of the fire was cooking. It was used to cook porridge in common cauldrons, to roast meat if it could be found, and to bake tortillas. Hot food was vital for recuperation and warmth, especially in the cold season. The smell of cooking food wafted through the camp, creating an illusion of domestic comfort. The fire also provided warmth. Soaked and frozen archers gathered around the fire to dry their clothes and warm their chilled hands and feet. On cold nights, the warmth of the fire was the only escape from the cold, especially for those who slept in the open or in skinny tents. The campfire was also the center of social life in the camp. Comrades gathered around the fire to talk, share news, tell stories, play dice or cards if it was not forbidden. Here one could forget for a while about the hardships of war, relax, and feel part of the community. However, the campfire also posed a serious danger. The bright flames and smoke were highly visible from afar, especially at night, and could give away the location of the camp to the enemy. This made the camp vulnerable to surprise attack or shelling. That is why they tried to build small fires close to the enemy, or do without them at all, using only small, well-hidden hearths for cooking. Sometimes for camouflage, fires were built in pits or behind natural shelters. The safety of the camp was paramount, and comfort had to be sacrificed for secrecy. Lack of firewood was also a frequent problem, especially during long sieges or operations in treeless terrain. Soldiers had to make long and dangerous forays for fuel, risking ambush. Each log was worth its weight in gold and was used very sparingly. Despite all the difficulties and dangers, the fire remained for the archer a symbol of hope and temporary relief. It gave not only physical warmth, but also mental warmth, uniting people, exhausted by war, in a single combat brotherhood. It was a rare and therefore especially valued luxury in their harsh lives. In the brutal world of medieval warfare, The survival of the English archer depended not only on his physical strength and endurance, but also on his tactical literacy, martial prowess, and ability to use his weapons to maximum effect. These were his invisible shield and sword. English archers were famous for their discipline and ability to act in concert. They did not shoot indiscriminately, but in volleys, on command, creating a veritable cloud of arrows capable of stopping an attack by the most formidable knight's cavalry. This tactic required long training and iron stamina. An important element of tactics was the proper use of terrain. Archers tried to occupy dominant heights, use natural shelters, create artificial obstacles in the form of pointed stakes. The ability to quickly assess the situation and choose the best position often decided the outcome of the battle. Each archer was a master of his craft. He had to be fluent in the technique of longbow shooting, be able to quickly and accurately aim the weapon, take into account the force and direction of the wind, the distance to the target. The rate of fire of an English archer reached 10 to 12 shots per minute, an incredible figure. In addition to shooting, an archer had to be skilled in close combat. Although their main task was to fire from a distance, sometimes they had to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Therefore, every archer had a sword, dagger, or axe, and knew how to use them, although not as skillfully as a knight. The quality of equipment was of great importance. A bow made of yew, properly plumed arrows with different types of tips, armor-piercing bodkins, wide dovetails, a strong bowstring. All this was carefully selected and maintained in working condition. The archer often made or repaired his own arrows. Psychological training also played an important role. The archer had to keep his cool under a hail of enemy arrows, not to panic, to follow commands clearly. The experience gained in previous battles hardened the character, made the warrior more resilient and confident in his abilities. Interaction with other branches of the army, especially heavy infantry and knights, was also an important element of tactics. Archers had to cover their comrades, and those in turn had to defend them from enemy attacks. The coherence of the entire army was the key to overall victory. Skill and tactical competence were not just professional skills of the English archer, they were the condition of his survival. In the chaos of battle, where death lurked at every turn, it was these qualities, multiplied by courage and fortitude, that allowed him not only to fulfill his combat task, but also to hope that he would see the next dawn. So, the life of a medieval English archer was far from romantic notions. It was a harsh, grueling, and dangerous path, requiring not only incredible physical strength and marksmanship, but also great endurance, mental stability, and readiness to face death every day. Behind the splendor of the victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were the sweat, blood, and tears of thousands of ordinary men who gave their lives or health in the service of the King in England. Their mighty bows were not only a formidable weapon, but also a heavy burden that wore down their bodies. Long treks, meager rations, icy overnight stays, constant fear, and the horrors of war. That's what these legendary warriors were really made of. But it was their skill, courage, and fighting brotherhood that for many years determined the military superiority of England. If you want to learn more about what it was like to be a warrior in the past, to penetrate the mysteries of medieval battles and understand the cost of great victories, subscribe to our channel. We will continue to explore the most fascinating and sometimes shocking pages of military history, so you can see the past as it really was.